Well, today we've got another expert from the industry and a lot of questions going on right now and perspectives on supply issues within the adjuvant industry and the crop protection industry, uh, both from finished product and from ingredients that go into the products. And today we have a gentleman named Dr. Rick Beardmore. He has extensive experience overseas, China and other places, on supply issues. He also had worked with, I believe, UAP and Makashi Nagan and actually with AgriAlliance, the predecessor to Winfield, which where I had a chance to meet up with Rick and we worked together for a couple of years. So, Rick, I'd like for you to give a little background on yourself beyond what I just mentioned.
Well, greetings, Bob, and thanks for this opportunity. As you mentioned, well, my background, I won't spend too much time, but I started out in product management and sales with American Cyanamid before I went to UAP. Spent a lot of years with UAP, and that's where I learned some of the things that focused my energies on sourcing and supply line. Working for distribution, it taught me those lessons of know where your supply is coming from, and if you don't have the low cost supply, you're not going to be competitive very long. Then I went to Maktashim Magan, and with Maktashim, that's where I first started working. Well, it was an Israeli company, but I started having some interaction with the offshore Indian and Chinese companies. Then I came to Winfield, or AgriAlliance, sorry, Bob, where we got to work together, and that's where I really focused on supply line. When I was at AgriAlliance, I was essentially over the supply for the entire division for crop protection, adjuvants, and micronutrients. And I started going to China on a regular basis. Not that we were going to go generic, but I wanted to know where my supply was coming from, whether it was coming from one of the majors. I wanted to see their factory. I wanted to make sure that we didn't have any supply hiccups like we are witnessing this year, or interjected toxicities that we weren't aware of. And I'll bring up the melamine issue on pet foods, which was quite a few years ago. But it was an intermediate that was getting mixed into pet foods, and it was getting done overseas, and it was toxic to pets here. And that was one of the things I really was keenly focused on, working for a company that was attached to, well, UAP was ConAgra, and AgriAlliance, Winfield is Land O'Lakes. And I say, in working for a major food company, the last thing we need as a crop protection or a crop provider input company is a hiccup that makes the food company look bad. So that's always been part and parcel to my focus when I was looking at supply lines. A, making sure you had a tight supply line, and B, making sure it was safe. And there was, if there was a weak link, where is it, and identify it.
Very good. You mentioned China and your trips over there, and a lot of our ingredients are sourced from over there, particularly the pesticides. So if we lose pesticide ingredients and short supply on pesticides, that means they're not going to get applied, and we're not going to be able to use adjuvants with them. So from today and from maybe last year or whenever, what is your take on the imports from China?
Well, China is a really deep subject, and it goes back several years. I mean, I started going back. Well, I've been doing business with China now for 20 years, and going there on a regular basis for probably over 15. Haven't been in 2 years. Haven't been since COVID started, but then everything has been shut down. But prior to that, about 2 to 3 years prior, the Chinese wised up. They used to trade on a cost plus basis. So whatever their cost was, they'd mark it up X%. And there was enough room in the market for the distributor and the freight handler and, the everybody down to the farmer, that there was enough trade margin in there to make it worth everybody's time. Then about 4 or 5 years ago, China got wise and they started going to market-based pricing. And one spring, they took everything up across the board about 30%. And it was across the board, and I saw it happen. And that was just before the fall that the past administration put in their trade tariffs. So China took their prices up about 30, and they publicized it, 35% across the board on pesticides in the spring. And that fall, the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs. So that put a hard brake on product coming from China. The question you asked, though, is if you look at our portfolio of products we use in this country, almost all of them are manufactured in China or have intermediates that are key to China. I did it when these dynamics started taking place several years ago. People were getting nervous. There's something else going on in China. There's been a rapid consolidation in China. There used to be multiple suppliers of every molecule. Two of the biggest ag chemical company used to be Swiss, and the biggest generic ag chemical company that used to be Israeli are both now owned by the same company, which are Chinese based in Beijing. And they started going through and rationalizing suppliers and manufacturers. So if you look at the biggest branded product and the biggest generic company are basically working together. So there's been a rationalization of technicals that started. So people started looking offshore, and India, and there's other nations, but India was a big one where people started moving. And I did an exercise just a couple of years ago for a client on, okay, here's the active ingredients that we can get a good position on from other countries. What weak links do these ingredients have that tie back to China? And basically intermediates. And I was astonished that almost every one of them had an intermediate or some other component of its manufacturing process that went back to China. So to understate China is nobody should take that lightly. The impact that China has on our crop protection and chemicals business. It goes back to the 90s, the Pacific Trade Agreement. That's when we started moving all that manufacturing offshore, for good reasons or bad. But where we're at today with freight, logistics, the ocean freight 3 years ago was $1,200 to $1,500 per container. Today they're getting $25,000 to $30,000 per container. So you imagine that goes across the cost of goods of whatever you're shipping in there, from whether it's technical active ingredient to ping pong balls. That $25,000 is getting added to the cost of goods. And in an industry, as you know, Bob, where a nickel or a quarter at the farm gate, makes or breaks whether you get the sale or not. The mere fact that if you can even get the product, that's a major issue for a lot of distribution and a lot of the ag chemical companies. And I think this is the first year we've ever seen force majeure in the industry, where Bayer said they couldn't honor their glyphosate contracts. And I always thought, how could that be? Because, they were Monsanto, and Monsanto was back integrated all the way back. And that was one of the things when you look at glyphosate, I focused on, it goes back to phosphorus and water, basically, is where you start. So how could Monsanto / Bayer be out? Well, it turned out to be an intermediate that they didn't have control over. Same thing happened to Corteva, I understand, this spring. I don't know all the details, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I think it was one of their cetaclores. They weren't able to fulfill all their contracts because they were missing a key, an intermediate that they didn't control. So I think supply line is part and parcel. A lot of people are getting a lesson in supply line integrity this year, not just in ag chemicals, but in other things as well. The other thing going on in China, when you asked, right now, Shanghai's been shut down for almost 3 months. I got a very good friend and past partner, current partner in Shanghai, who hasn't left his apartment in over 80 days. He gets out of his apartment briefly for some air and to get PCR tested. Well, that's across a city of 23 million people, and that means they're not at the ports, they're not loading trucks, they're not filling out shipping documents. He can't get to his office administration staff can't get to their office. And these are things people don't see going on. This isn't in the news, but this is happening, and all that's going to affect our supply and shipment timeframes. I just saw this morning on Target, who's a Minneapolis-based company. They just announced they're canceling shipping or orders for contracts. Most of their stuff's coming from China. And the reason they're canceling their orders is because it's just now getting here and the season's changed. And where we used to be able to get shipments in 2 to 4 weeks from China, we used to be literally from Shanghai to Tacoma was 2 weeks. and now it's taken months. Well, they don't need swimming pools anymore. Now they're starting to stock for the fall already. Anyway, well,
Boy, that
short
is,
question, but a long answer.
that's a really interesting information. Makes you really think about it. Uh, Going forward, do you see any improvements with the supply? Because what we're hearing from different organizations and leaders in the industry and crop protection are saying that they're going to keep their inventories to a minimum because with all the high prices, if we start getting supply back, they don't want to be caught with high priced inventory. How do you see that pricing going forward on crop protection products and adjuvants?
Boy, if I had that crystal ball, I'd retire tomorrow. Um, but I can see where everything's at a high price, and you think, well, if it's going to go higher, I'll buy now. Can it go higher? It's almost unsustainable now. And the situation with China, I don't know. There's so much going on. It's political. We try to stay out of politics, but if you go China, Taiwan, what's going on there, the relationships between the U.S. and China right now, the fact that the ships are backed up, yeah, I don't see it changing anytime soon. And in the ag business, we're on a growing cycle, so we have our seasonal business. But um, I think if you can get product right now, you need to get to whatever you need to fill your needs because it's not going to improve. Even if they flip the switch tomorrow, these pipelines aren't going to open up and get back to normal it's going to take a couple of years for all these things to get sorted out, at least 2 years to get these things sorted out.
Okay.
In the meantime, people are looking for alternate sources, and moving manufacturing.
Well, talking about alternate sources, we keep hearing about going back to U.S. production. Again, with the high cost of petroleum products and oil and even seed oils. Uh, how do you see the U.S. production keeping up or what's going to happen in the future?
I honestly don't see the U.S. getting back into the heavy chemical, pesticides industry like we used to have. The environmental regulations and, as you manage the energy constraints and the energy costs that are part and parcel of the base cost of most pesticides. I don't see that coming back to U.S. soil anytime soon. I don't know if it's going to be stable in China. I don't know what the future of China holds, whether they're going to continue to be a stable source or whether they're going to, whether it moves somewhere else. You don't put these factories up overnight, and in the US, it takes years to get the permits. So,
Yeah, it does. Well, that's a pretty good background you're giving on our supply issues, particularly internationally. But here back in the U.S., seems like there's an uproar in Washington D.C. every day over one thing or another. But you really don't hear too much about the egg program or some of the decisions from the EPA affecting U.S. ag pesticide and adjuvant production and all the way down to the use at the farm gate. I know you spent some time doing things in Washington. Is there anything that stands out in your mind that is really driving either good or bad for the egg economy?
I saw you had that question up there, and it was kind of, as I was getting ready for this, it made me kind of smile a little bit and go, wow, I haven't even heard of the ag program or talked to anybody about it. Of course, we got an election cycle coming up in November, and all of a sudden, top of the ticket's Roe v. Wade and gun control, and the same old things. And it's like, wow, we're not talking about the ag program. The biggest thing I see, in the ag sector that's concerning to me, on the input side is the rising price of diesel and what that does at the farm gate and what that does, to everything there. The rising price of fertilizer that's tied to the energy. Urea is up $1,100, $1,200 a ton. And that's if you can get a truck underneath it. And then the truck's taking a couple $100 of freight to get it to the gate. I mean, people don't add up the trickle. You talk about trickle down or trickle up, the impact this is going to have on the farm gate at the input side. But then you're looking at all these processing plants and, chicken factories, and the big the egg layer up in Minnesota just burned, 3 million eggs a day. And the FDA is shutting down farm, small farm operations. And it just seems to be there's a complete attack on our food supply and the food chain at the moment, which I think is a huge concern for the American population, not just the ag input industry, but for the American population in total.
Well, you talked about fertilizer prices being what they are. One question is a lot of fertilizers produced in Russia and in the Ukraine. Uh, do you have any thoughts about how that's going to influence the American market on fertilizer? Obviously, they're up right now. Do you know what extent that supply comes from that region?
Oh boy, not off the top of my head. I've seen the numbers. It's significant. Globally, the amount of grain that comes out of the Ukraine, wheat, cereals, and as you mentioned, the fertilizer, urea, and I think phosphorus comes out of there. But right now, we're not making our own urea. You know, uh, it's a tough situation. You talk to any of the farmers in the area. It's a struggle. Well, the other and tied to that, because tied to the urea, is the DEF, and not everybody knows what DEF is, but that's the diesel exhaust fluid that all the diesel trucks since 2010 need to have DEF, and if you don't have DEF, they go into creep mode. And DEF is made of 32%. It's basically 32% urea. And was it Flying J just had a proclamation the other day that they've been told to cut their quota by 30%. And they were in front of Congress saying, if we don't have DEF, the trucks stop. So to add insult to industry, add insult to injury, besides the costs going through the roof, you might not even be able to get diesel or DEF.
That's an interesting point. I mean, everything is by truck a lot in the ag industry,
Yep.
as every other things. Are there any other issues that you know of that you'd like to tell us about that you think might be an issue, either good or bad?
No, I think we're witnessing. I don't know. It's a catastrophe of supply lines, and it's not just the ag side. It's you go to the local markets, and depends on where you are, but grocery stores, Targets are starting to look empty. Fleet Farm, it's not looking very good, and it all ties to freight. I mean, the ocean freight, and then once you get it here, you got to put a truck or a train under it, and we're having trouble getting trucks and trains under things. So it's a backup, and once you back up a supply line, it's going to take a while to clear that out. It's like a plugged pipe.
Well, one last question for you, Rick. I know you've done a pretty good job of going over some of the issues. Uh, we're going to be heading into our fall business season where traditionally a lot of distributors and retailers fill their inventories early at discounts for the following year. Uh, do you have any thoughts about what the fall business might look like this year?
Boy, I hate to speculate, but I don't see prices. I don't see any price crash on the horizon. We've seen bubbles in the past, but I don't see this one bursting anytime soon. At least not by this fall. Maybe after November. Who knows? But come September, October, I wouldn't be counting on it.
Well, that's the end of the questions I had for you, Rick. And I'd like to say I very much appreciate you spending the time with us with your vast background and years of experience, and particularly in these issues of supply and what's going on Capitol Hill. So, Rick, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll be able to do this again.
Well, thank you, Bob. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Take care.